Thank you, Professor Edwards. Anytime that you feel failed as an academic, anytime that you're depressed about what you've accomplished or not, go back and listen to a recording of Professor Edwards' introduction. An automatic and very generous account of one's career. So thank you, Walter. I don't think I ever mentioned to you that I've been here so long that I was actually on the university committee that helped draft the proposal to NEH for the Humanities Center. So I even go back further in my connection to the wonderful center that you have built and has been thriving under your leadership. In many respects, I think of Professor Edwards as not only a friend and colleague, but also as a valuable mentor. Thank you for inviting me back to speak again. I've given myself a fairly lengthy charge here in laying out what I'm hoping to do, and that is to first talk about the Southern Confederacy. I was originally trained in the history of the South in the 19th century, and my first publications were in the history of the South and the Confederacy. And because in the end it is important in understanding the ways in which the Confederacy and Confederate memorials have been used, we need to have a starting point. And I will have to say that I planned my talk out, and at least the general ideas for my talk, before John Oliver did an amazing takedown of Confederate monuments that builds on very fine scholarship, and the writing isn't as good as, well, anyway, after this, if you haven't seen it, I would urge you to see his discussion on Confederate monuments, which is, I think, quite wonderful. Almost everyone who talks about the Confederacy talks about Alexander H. Stephens, who did have a top on his head, which I, in my elegant cut and paste, have chopped off. When you read some of what he's written, you may have indeed think that someone at an earlier period had chopped off his head. Stephens was the vice president of the Confederate States of America, and he's famous or infamous for his cornerstone speech in which he declared that slavery and white supremacy were indeed the cornerstone of the Confederacy. He was a brilliant guy, gave an extemporaneous talk soon after the Confederate States Constitution had been adopted, which, by the way, enshrined slavery forever in the South and made it forever inviolable. He, in his speech, he eventually turned to the causes of the war and an analysis of the South in slavery. The new Constitution has put to rest forever all the agitating questions relating to our peculiar institution, African slavery, as it exists among us, as the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization. And then he goes on, in case you've heard about the importance of state rights and northern aggression, he points out that slavery was the immediate cause of the late rupture and present revolution. He then proceeds to go back to the founding generation and to observe that the founders, even though they protected slavery in the Constitution, assumed that slavery was a violation of the laws of nature and would eventually, perhaps miraculously or through the actions of Providence, lead to slavery's elimination. But the Confederacy, our new government, Stevens said, is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not the equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. This truth has been slow in the process of its development, like all other truths in the various departments of science. And he, in fact, goes on to draw upon the gradual acceptance of scientific theory in the Western world in the 18th and 19th centuries. The cornerstone speech is almost always I almost always use it as a culminating point in lectures when I teach about the Civil War in the defense of slavery. What is perhaps most striking about Alexander Stephens is, yes, everyone knows he was vice president of the Confederacy, but what is generally not known is how resistant to secession Stephens had been, how he had been regarded as, for most of his career, as a conservative nationalist. One of his closest friends in the 1846, after the 1846 election in Congress, was a gawky fellow from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, who served his only term in the House of Representatives as a buddy of his fellow Whig, Alex Stephens. The reason I mention Stephens' political background is that it speaks to not simply the public statement of a vice president of a new country, but in fact it speaks to the breadth of white support for the Confederacy and for the defense of slavery. The idea that slavery was a good thing, that it was endorsed by both science and God, and they often flip back and forth between Hamite stories and the new ethnology, the work of physical anthropologists, and as a consequence, it didn't matter. But what Stevens is getting at here is the way in which white Southerners, and this cut across geographical boundaries and it cut across class lines. There's virtually no dissent among white Southerners in their defense of slavery. It's not as if there is conflict. If there was conflict, you left the South. You didn't stay. One professor at the University of North Carolina came out in 1856 for the Republican presidential candidate John C. Fremont, and he was promptly fired and driven out of the state and out of the South. He was a northern outlier. You know, even in the 1850s, academic jobs were hard to find. But his position was untenable and he left. I think, again, in all the work that I've done, what I've been struck by is even people who hated the Confederacy, hated Jefferson Davis, ended up as vigorous supporters of the institution of slavery and ultimately supportive of the Confederacy. The Southern whites had imagined, of course, that in leaving the Union, that they would emerge triumphant and be able to preserve slavery forever. They imagined endless military victories if the North had acted with foolhardiness and tried to prevent secession and separation. They lost. One of the great ironies of the war was that slavery, in fact, was going nowhere. Republicans did not want slavery to expand, but there's very little doubt that slavery could have easily lasted decades if the southern states had stayed in the Union. But as you know, they seceded, they lost. Their greatest military hero, Robert E. Lee, immediately said, "We got to put this behind us, please. It's not wise to erect monuments in our name. We should not memorialize what we've done because basically we're going to make somebody angry and conflict will invariably ensue." And in the end, there were very few Confederate monuments built. There's the biggest monument, a little to the left. No, this is a graph of Confederate monuments built, and it starts with the end of the war and the period of the greatest monument building. It's really starting in 1895, peaking in the early 1910s, and thriving really in a lot of ways on into the 1930s. But those are just the various monuments, sites, it's only later that the green dots, those are schools. Southern Poverty Law Center has pointed out that a number of those schools, in fact, are overwhelmingly attended by African American students. The question that gets raised then is, Southerners were not intent on commemorating the Confederacy in the first decades after the war. But come the 1890s, they started paying careful attention to a protest against Confederate monuments. The building of these monuments coincides with an important development in Southern history, which is the emergence and triumph of rigid legal segregation, the disfranchisement of African American men, the exclusion or the segregation of schools that invested in the education of white children, not in black children. And in effect, it is not a coincidence that the monuments that were being built were actually affirmations of racism and white supremacy. I'll come back to this, but I forgot to show you Silent Sam at the University of North Carolina, a Confederate soldier. It supported, like many Confederate monuments, by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Took several years for them to raise enough money. Finally, the powers that be at the University of North Carolina, in addition to their support for academic athletic scandals, at a later time, they also chipped in for this monument to white supremacy. Silent Sam was, according to Julian Carr, saviors of the Anglo-Saxon race. And then he told and I'm not going to read it, you can read it yourself, it's revolting to read, but this was part of his public speech at the commemoration of Silent Sam at the University of North Carolina in 1913. And it tells you in gruesome detail about the import of racism and the assertion of white supremacy that is evident in not just Carr's speech, but in the actions taken against, in this case, African American North Carolinians during this period of intensifying segregation. The second reason for the emergence of these monuments, but which is in important ways connected to the first, is the emergence of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who raised money all over the South for these almost always cheaply made statues that were almost always manufactured in the North. But their goal, in effect, speaks to a newer understanding of the Confederacy that tidies it up, that sanitizes it, that articulates a vision of the Confederacy that is based upon state rights, based upon a defense of home, based upon a defense of the soil, based upon local rights. Slavery itself is incidental to the discussion. And while someone like Alexander H. Stephens and virtually every other Confederate soldier going to war understood the importance of slavery in the decision for secession, it was much more acceptable in making an argument that this was about state rights. It was not about slavery. It was not about race. It was about preserving civilization. And at the same time, in this reimagining of the Civil War, also represents a triumph of and here I would love to spend more time on it, but point out that this represents a triumph of white nationalism in the United States. Although Union veterans organizations were protesting, although African Americans protested, by 1900 there was a general consensus among white scholars, North and South, that the South had fought for state rights, that the South had benefited from the end of slavery, that was a good thing because it held the South, that is the white South, back, but that, oh, I'm sliding. Thank you. A vision that it was intended to recognize that Reconstruction, giving black men and women authority over their own lives, real autonomy in the case of black men, the right to vote, that this had all been a giant mistake. And by 1900, scholarly consensus was that returning the South and power in the South to benevolent whites was the best thing for the South and for the nation, including not just its white population, but its African American population as well. It is not unusual to see that the heart of this academic interpretation actually had as its center Columbia University. And I'm not talking about a university in Columbia, South Carolina, the one in New York City. William Dunning and John Burgess articulated the consensus among scholars that held sway for most of the next half century. So when Southerners were building monuments, it was not a big surprise that they found few objections in the North. Even the U.S. Capitol. In the middle of the Civil War, actually right before the Civil War, they agreed to abandon the old chamber of the House of Representatives, which was acoustically a disaster. So they had this big empty chamber that they decided to open for statuary. And states were invited to contribute 2 statues to the collection. And most states didn't bother. Few northern states chipped in. No southern state contributed a monument until 1905. And then, that's a kind of squat version of Robert E. Lee. This is maybe if monuments are intended to create an extraordinary, imposing figure, my creation of PowerPoint slides is clearly intended to bring people down to size. Wearing Confederate dress uniform. The striking, and it met with significant resistance from African American scholars and journalists, opposition from several veterans groups, but had no problem gaining acceptance with the national government ultimately, because Robert E. Lee had gone from being a Confederate to being an American hero. And then this marks the beginning of each of the Confederate states sending at least one Confederate hero to the U.S. Capitol. Perhaps the greatest of Confederate/American heroes, Jefferson Davis himself, has a place in the U.S. Capitol, donated by Mississippi, his home state, in 1931. Enshrining a particular vision of the South, of race relations, and Southern history in the Capitol. And since then, and here I always think that this is one of the great ironies, because it's amazing how many bad Confederate generals they've named American military bases off of. I mean, you all hear about Fort Bragg, but nobody who studies the Civil War has anything good to say about the generalship of General Braxton Bragg. It's also striking, and I think this is important as well, is that you don't see any military bases, any Confederate monuments named after Augustus Longstreet, who arguably was one of the top 3 or 4 Confederate generals. The problem with commemorating Longstreet was that after the war, he became a Republican and came out in favor of equal rights for blacks, worked with African Americans in Louisiana, and hardly surprising in the environment that I've just described, no one thought his generalship began to decline in quality after the fact. The second surge, and I'm jumping now because I want to leave a little time for us to have some conversation. It's important to keep in mind that throughout the 1940s and 50s, the only dissenters from this historical point of view were African American scholars, generally teaching at historically black colleges and universities, and in the end, their voices were entirely ignored by mainstream white historians. So what we're talking about is a persistence in American culture. I mean, if you read John F. Kennedy's Profiles in Courage, one of the profiles was of Samuel Pomeroy of Kansas, who voted against the removal of Andrew Johnson in office. Not really a profile in courage, but because Kennedy imagined when he wrote it that Reconstruction was this awful, evil thing that had been imposed on the white South. And so a profile of courage was someone, in courage, was someone who stood up to that. And that was written in the late 1950s. But you didn't see a lot of monument building really until 1948 and beyond, with the rise of the civil rights movement, the Dixiecrat candidacy of Strom Thurmond, who, when the Democratic Party adopted a civil rights plank in its 1948 platform, a plank introduced by the rabble-rousing liberal mayor of Minneapolis, Hubert Horatio Humphrey, Thurmond left the convention hall and they ran a separate state rights party campaign whose emblem was the Confederate battle flag, which is the flag you see waved in too many places today. In effect, what we have here is the emergence of statuary, monuments, schools in resistance to the civil rights movement. Georgia, and to some extent, all of these things are tied up in Civil War commemorations. It also is around the time of the Civil War centennial. Reasonable enough. Except Georgia, well before the centennial in 1956, began to include the Confederate battle flag in its flag. In 1961, South Carolina raised the Confederate flag. Mississippi had included it, not surprisingly, back in 1894. These are key to understanding the history of the monuments, are key to understanding why the monuments today are so politically fraught. It's no accident, in the end, that Confederate symbols have been the mainstay of white supremacist and neo-Nazi organizations, from the Ku Klux Klan to the skinheads, from the neo-Nazis in the United States to the neo-Nazis in Germany. At President Trump's speech in Poland, Confederate flag was waving. The swastika is illegal to display in Germany. Neo-Nazis will sometimes trot out the Confederate battle flag, a sign of racism and white supremacy. And they do so because they were waving the flag of the battle. It's actually the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee's army. But in effect, they are paying homage to the Confederate States of America, which in itself was based on ideals. In particular, the ideal that the Negro is not the equal to the white man. In the end, these monuments are monuments to racism and white supremacy. And the odd question that I have for myself at the end of the day, as a historian of the South who spent months doing research in graduate school at the University of North Carolina in their wonderful Southern Historical Collection, was that I must have walked by Silent Sam 100 times and didn't give it a second thought. It's the 1970s. So, of course, never occurred to me, and I was writing about the Confederacy. This is my mea culpa. But didn't even cross my mind that that would not be there, or that Governor Zebulon Vance of the Civil War governor of North Carolina would not be on a horse at the State House. And I think that, and even a couple of years ago, friends who I knew from graduate school, also writing Southern history, had urged me to sign a petition to keep the monuments as a point of historical discussion. Clearly, we're way past that point, because when you go and you look at Charlottesville and you see what, and I put it in quotation marks, our heritage means, when Lindsey Graham, who has built a new reputation as an adversary of President Trump, after the murders in Charleston, Graham said, but this is about preserving our history. It never occurred to him to challenge the meaning of the pronoun and to whom it referred. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions, go into greater depth on particular points. I hadn't read the Cornerstone speech in a long time, and I was taken aback, not by the parts that are familiar to many people, but the way in which he develops a scientific defense of slavery and compares Southern whites to, I mean, I think he uses Harvey on blood, the circulation of blood, and Galileo. I mean, that these are ideas that took time to be embraced as scientific truths. Yes?
I guess my question is, I remember growing up in high school with the idea that states' rights was the cornerstone of everything that was Southern. When you said that it was, I had heard that people say, oh yes, slavery was important, but it was always the states' rights. And that ideology has been maintained for so long. Do you think it was a defense of institutional racism? And was it politically used in that way?
Well, let me, state rights is a way of exercising power. And in the 1850s alone was deployed in different ways by both Southerners and Northerners. In the South, after the so-called Compromise of 1850, in the Compromise, Congress passed a law which made it easier for slave owners to recover fugitive slaves. And it actually tilted things quite heavily in the direction of the South. The U.S. Constitution itself provides for the U.S. government's responsibility for runaway servants. So it's in the Constitution. But this tilted things so that federal marshals got paid more money if a runaway slave was returned rather than won his or her freedom in the North. But in that case, Southerners were cheering on the exercise of federal power, and Northern states were passing what were known as personal liberty laws that were intended to resist the federal government's overreach in trying to recapture fugitive slaves. So that's the case in 1852. In 1858 and 59, Southerners, white Southerners in the Democratic Party were arguing for not just that the federal government couldn't keep slavery out of federal territories, but that it actually had a positive responsibility to protect slavery in those territories. And then a year later, they went out defending state rights. I mean, during the 1850s, it really depended on, in effect, whose ox was being gored. So Northerners were not defending state rights when Southerners claimed to have the right as states to leave the Union. It is a political tool, or a valuable tool. Because it gets to the heart of thinking about appeals to constitutional ideals surrounding federalism. But these are defenses of slavery. When they leave the Union defending their freedom. There's against Northern incursions. Lincoln calls for troops to suppress the rebellion. They say we're fighting against tyranny. But it is essential to understand that the freedom they're defending is the freedom to own slaves. It's their autonomy, to be sure. It is their liberty. And I don't mean to suggest that slavery was the only cause of the Civil War, but the Civil War could not have happened without slavery.
Go ahead.
Todd?
I had two questions I wanted to pose. One comes out of the resonance that I was really getting as you described the change in a sense of national identity with respect to the late 19th century, and then the way that the sort of reconciliation between North and South in ways kind of embodied by these various acts of acceptance of statuary and so on. And I was thinking of the plantation narratives and why reading audience in the North as well as the South that enjoyed the sort of sanitized version of slavery in the South, and how all of that was sort of present kind of in that late 19th century period. And so one question was, as the Daughters of the Confederacy emerged, and sponsored so many of the monuments, was that during that late 19th century period, and did it extend into the 30s?
It extended at least into the 20s, and I don't know the exact role that they played after. I'd be surprised if they weren't playing, continuing to play some role, and they have, of course, been persuaded by their own vision of the South.
Yes. Well,
And the white South and the Confederacy. It's not that they've persuaded themselves.
yes, but then that question comes also out of my having been a student at the University of Louisville, my hometown. Kentucky was a border state, slave state, but didn't secede. Prominently erected in front of the University of Louisville is a very tall Confederate monument that was conspicuously put up by the Daughters of the Confederacy. And only now has it been challenged, and it may be on its way out, or at least there's a lot of discussion about its placement and so on. So that question was kind of, where is the Daughters of the Confederacy now? What are they doing?
Yeah, I do have a comment though, since I can't, I'll find out about what they're doing now. I don't have that knowledge. But the Kentucky example is absolutely fascinating. I always tell my students that Kentucky was the last state to join the Confederacy, but they did it after the Civil War. It's like a retrospective membership in the Confederacy. They latch on to the idea that the Confederate government included Kentucky and Missouri, but Kentucky had supported the Union. It's only in the post-emancipation period that you see Kentuckians reimagining their past as Confederates. And you end up with Confederate statues, bizarrely in Lexington and Louisville, in ways that should have been, in some ways, like the worst places to have tried to do it. But it does also speak to the triumph of a in the late 19th and early 20th century, a triumph of a particular vision of the past and the present. The UDC played an important role in establishing the Museum of the Confederacy, which is an excellent museum. And the commitment to preserving the past has been a very good thing from my perspective as a historian who spent also a significant amount of time doing research in Richmond.
Another question arising sort of from the same kind of personal context has to do with the Daughters of the American Revolution, and thinking again of this sort of national reconciliation and acquiescence to a lot of this symbology. And I can't help but remember the DAR's position with respect to Marian Anderson singing in front of the Lincoln Memorial, or anywhere, in Constitutional Hall, sorry.
Right.
So then she did eventually sing in front of the memorial. So that contestation that was taking place there was interesting. And I just wondered about the DAR, if they had accepted this transformation, this reimagining of, the South, the Civil War, and national identity.
Well, I think that the way in which they prevented Marian Anderson from singing there, though she did kind of stick it to them singing in front of the Lincoln Memorial, suggests that yes, but in that sense they were not different from the vast majority of white people. And like others, I think you can see a kind of gradual adaptation to changing understandings of the Revolution, race, and the Civil War too, in thinking in the ways in which the United Daughters of the Confederacy presents the past, the way the DAR presents the past, and the way I was just invited
Mark,
to
we're running out of time, and I'd like to join the conversation because I know Dr. Edwards is going to pretty say we have no time. And I have a
okay,
couple
well, let me just to finish is that the movement has been to accept scholarly and newer popular realities as organizations. Yes, Jose?
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed it, and
Thank you.
notating it because I think it's an important presentation for me. I just want to point out that in the bigger global picture, that whether it's a monarchy or a nation state who are conquering other peoples, they always have to justify by typecasting the conquered or would-be conquered as an inferior race. Racialization is all over the damn place. So for example, for our black African-American friends, it's not just you that have been colonized. Native Americans were literally wiped off the face of the earth. When the United States decided that they needed the West, they stereotyped Mexicans as monkeys because they had no right to the land because they were misusing it. And that kind of stereotyping continues on a state-by-state level, people-by-people level. But also, racism is a tool. It takes on a life of its own, to the point where, for example, poor whites are willing to sacrifice their economic interest in order to have racial superiority. But racial superiority also is a tool of the rich and powerful who divide the working class into white and black and use the white working class against the black. Right now, the Mexicans are being demonized as mother rapers and baby killers and criminals, and they're doing most of the damn work in this damn country. So you have this very complex equation, and it's astounding how the white nationalists can transfer the meaning of the Confederate flag to our American flag. And you're exactly right that this movement of white nationalism is a strong reaction to the civil rights movement, but what the civil rights movement means for everybody, because now we were well on our way to being a multicultural nation, in which not only African Americans who led the civil rights movement, but the Latino civil rights movement, and even the civil rights movement of women, of the disabled, of others. Every other group that had been seen as inferior by that white male superior group rose up, and we're becoming a different nation, and they want to go back to the old days. And so I just wanted to add that larger context because I study the topic too.
Okay. Yes.
As a Texan, I don't know. I see this like in high school and middle school. You see people wearing the Confederate flags as T-shirts and whatnot, and saying how they feel out loud. But the one thing I don't get is, like he brought up, is the white supremacists. Like, how do you think that you're better than a race when you're all human beings? Like, yeah, you're different colors, but you have the same organs and whatnot. So
Well,
where does the
even that, though, we know from the work of physical anthropologists that and cultural anthropologists, the whole idea of race is an idea. It's a social construct. It's not based on a particular concrete physical reality. So in that sense, both race and racism, these are created, and how they evolve and emerge at different places in different times will in fact vary. And if you go back to the time of the major monument construction that was taking place, it's right in the middle of that. We're hearing Professor Cuello talked about how we're becoming a majority-minority country over the next couple of decades. The fear of that happening is evident in the period of the first monument building. Madison Grant wrote a book in 1913, The Disappearance of the Great White Race, arguing that whites were being overwhelmed, and his vision of white meant that people from Southern and Eastern Europe were considered part of a lesser race. Hence, hostility to Italians, to Jews, that are interpreted racially. So, in effect, how these things change has to be seen in its particular historical context. And in the case of monument building, a piece of this has to do with efforts by whites to constrain the freedom of African Americans, to retain them as a semi-enslaved workforce that persisted really into the 20th century. And if you, I risk taking on too many subjects, but it's also right in the middle of this monument building that African Americans start leaving the South for the North. I mean, it's the peak's about 1910. Madison Grant's passing of the Great White Race is 1913. The Great Migration is beginning with World War I. These are happening together, and the actions by African Americans are in the face of the kind of rigid segregationist policies that white Southerners had been putting in place from the 1890s on.
Yeah, because I agree, because by year 2020, the minority is supposed to become the majority, so I feel like it is more white supremacist events happening now because they are, you're scared.
Well, I think that there's probably a bit of truth to that. So you see all this talk about whites as being victims. It's so the neo-Confederates, neo-Nazis, Klansmen who were marching at Charlottesville, their portrayal of everything is how whites are victimized by specially privileged and inferior minorities of different. So yes, it's framed in a way that they're victims, and I think it does express an unrealistic and idea that somehow white people are facing an existential threat, which is utter nonsense.
Yeah, ridiculous.
Anyone new? Yes.
I think, you said, what was the Buchanan book? Didn't Buchanan write something with sort of the same title, or maybe I'm imagining it? Just maybe 15 years ago, it was that Swamping or something. The title Martin Grant. Am I wrong?
I have to confess I don't read Buchanan very often. But I mean, he certainly is in some ways, his policies kind of predate the kind of racial populism that we've seen, and which has given a bad name to populism itself, which is not inherently a bad thing. Any other questions?
Yeah, I had a quick question.
Sure.
So I found it interesting, things I didn't know. I didn't know that the Confederate statues really started increasing in popularity around 1900s, you said, 1950s. And I guess my question was kind of going back towards, and I think it's still pertinent, but if like Andrew Johnson was kind of handling Reconstruction, right?
Or not handling it, as the case may be.
Well, if that would have been dealt with differently, and the Southern leaders would have been held more accountable to the war, and African Americans were not just not slaves anymore, but given equal rights right off the bat, or as much as they possibly could have at the time. Do you think that we're having this conversation, or it's a different conversation?
Well, during Reconstruction, African Americans did obtain rights. Immediately after the war, because of Johnson, power was left in the hands of the people who were considered to be the most moderate whites, folks like Alexander H. Stephens. A moderate white Southerner was someone who reluctantly became a Confederate. Not that they were not Confederates, but they were reluctant to be involved in secession. Those were the people Johnson empowered in 1865. It's not until, because whites were, the violence against newly freed African Americans was rampant in the South, especially in Texas, but elsewhere. And you got a sense of it in that Julian Carr proudly recounting how he beat a free black woman. That was a perfect example of the ways in which ideas about the place of blacks in Reconstruction, that was the vision of whites. And so they restricted rights of African Americans until Republicans in Congress took over policy gained a supermajority, so they were able to override Johnson's vetoes and establish black male suffrage and empowered African Americans who gained authority in the writing of constitutions and as legislators, as leaders in the executive branches of state governments, control of local offices. And when you've got government, it changes things. Access to public education for the first time. Access, oddly, to insane asylums, to schools for people with hearing or sight impairment. Penitentiaries had to be either integrated or create segregated ones, because before it was the master's responsibility to correct a slave. So the opportunity for real change, in fact, was taking place. The 15th Amendment protected the rights of black men to vote in a tenuous way, because by the 1890s, white Southerners had found ways around it. But there was a time where the consequences of the Civil War were moving in a direction of equality. It's why the greatest historian of American Reconstruction, his book Reconstruction, the subtitle is America's Unfinished Revolution.
That's kind of what I was thinking, like, along that line, though, like if someone had someone stepped up to the plate and followed through with these things as far as African American voting and making sure that they're able to get to the polls and things like that, and also holding the leaders of the Confederate responsible and almost like making examples of them. And from my understanding, they kind of got off pretty easily once the war was over.
One person was executed for his work as commandant of the Andersonville prison. Jefferson Davis spent a couple of years in prison before they decided not to try him. Johnson pardoned most white Southerners in May of 1865. Robert E. Lee went home, died a few years later. No punishment, no chastisement, no prison time, no hangings, and in effect, they were seeking to get a kind of voluntary acceptance of freedom on the part of Southern whites. Only in retrospect is it obvious that Southern whites were not the least bit flexible. Whenever opportunity came, their version of flexible was to allow black people to marry, but might not, depending on the state, include ownership of property, might not include the right not to sign a year-long labor contract with a planter, otherwise to be arrested as a vagrant, and your fine was to be farmed out to a planter. So the federal government did intervene. It did step in, it did overturn the black codes, it passed the 14th Amendment, passed the 15th Amendment, passed the Ku Klux Acts in 1870 and 1871 that were designed to protect the right of black men to vote in the South, and for a time worked. Sustaining that became very difficult. You can see for a moment, 1863, 64, into the 1870s, a sense that, that in effect African Americans had not just deserved their freedom as human beings, but the 185,000 African American men who fought during the war had also earned freedom and full citizenship. Before other people were talking about black men getting the right to vote, Abraham Lincoln was urging a constitutional convention in Louisiana in 1864 to consider enfranchising black veterans, because the idea of service as an entry point to full citizenship was embraced. And you can see in the political cartoons of the day portrayals of African American veterans in uniforms with a limb missing, portrayed clearly as in heroic fashion. By the mid-70s, the same people, same cartoonist, is portraying African Americans as ape-like and irrational, animalistic. And some of that stems from in effect, Northerners turning away from Reconstruction, because in the end, for Reconstruction to have succeeded, required a sustained federal presence. It wasn't just enforcing the Ku Klux Acts in 1871. It was also enforcing them in 1875. But when the Republican governor of Mississippi called for troops to protect African American voters from an extraordinary wave of racist violence, murders of Republican white and black politicians, the response he got was, "We're tired," this is from the Attorney General, "of these annual autumnal outbreaks in the South." It's like, enough is enough, you have the right to vote, protect yourself. And sustaining any kind of presence of the federal government also ran smack into a culture of political decentralization. Federal government wielded extraordinary power during and immediately after the war, but holding on to and sustaining that power ran against important norms in American political culture. And you see them retreating very quickly from assertions of national power. And this is in almost every realm of life, not just race, but the end of a national currency. An income tax that had been imposed in the Civil War, declared unconstitutional in the early 1870s by the Supreme Court. So sustaining it, and with the Depression of 1873, there's also a sense, we got to worry about ourselves. We got to worry about the panic. We can't keep turning to the South and spending both our attention and our fortune on the South. This is not working. We expected it to be solved by now, and if African Americans can't protect their own rights now, they're on their own. And maybe we made a mistake and need to let these well-meaning, all of this is in quotation marks, white men run the show because they know black people best.
All right.
You're welcome. Thank you all.